It's 10 o'clock in the evening. The light is fading fast now. I'm sitting on damp soil in one of the woodlands at High Ash Farm. The blackbirds, the robins and the song thrushes have all finished their evening song. And just at dusk, this is a long-established roost for jackdaws, carrion crows and rooks to bring their young to this area of woodland. And right now they're flying in the dusk above my head, and it's their kind of even song, if you like. I'd like to think of it as pillow talk. I'm just wondering what the jackdaws are saying to their young, and the rooks to their youngsters as they spend the night together, high up in the canopy above me. A lovely evening sound. Matthew Gudgeon will be with me in the morning, and we'll be looking at some of the summer orchids at High Ash Farm and visit a pond that's got one-eyed mini monsters swimming about in it. Join us then.
Chris Skinner's Countryside Podcast with Matthew Gudgeon.
It's surprisingly cool for approaching the middle of June, but still very pleasant, with patches of blue sky. And here at High Ash Farm, all is festooned with wildflower finery, and we've got some horses looking over the hedge at us as well. And here we are, a lesser spotted farmer as well to greet us. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Matthew. I'm the right side of the hedge. I don't need to crane my neck over and have a look at you. Oh, yes, it's cool this morning, and so the weather's very fickle for this June, but we've just had a mild, wet May. Very, very welcome at High Ash Farm. That old motto of wet May, long hay still holds true. And there's hay fields right at the top of the hill there. We're at the bottom of one of the valleys of High Ash Farm. And lots of variable soil types here. There's chalk just underneath where we're standing. If I gave you a spade and half an hour, you'd be turning out pure white chalk that you could write on a blackboard with.
Does the spade come with instructions?
Yes, you hold the handle and use your feet. But we're standing on one of the old tracks that run through High Ash Farm. It's got a lovely name. It's called Greensides Loke. And I do know there was a Greensides family living in the little keeper's cottage at the top. He was the gamekeeper for the farm, and the cottage is on a high spot overlooking quite a bit of High Ash Farm, so he could keep an eye on the pheasants and any of the other game, and he's very protective of it.
So poachers as well.
Oh yes, and I have kept a relic from Mr. Greensides when he left that house, and it's a poacher's gun, but not used by poachers, it's used by gamekeepers to shoot poachers, and things like that happened hundreds of years ago, whereas the Greensides family carried on right until the sort of mid-1900s, 1950, I think he perhaps left the property. But the gun has a cable, a tiny invisible piece of brass wire that goes across a woodland ride, and if anybody walks through, it sets off a little cannon hidden up, and your legs would be peppered with lead shot. Simple as that.
I don't think His Majesty's police force probably encourage that sort of thing these days.
There were things like man traps as well.
Oh,
huge,
yes, the great big teeth.
Yes, and if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But nevertheless, that's why this is called Greensides Loke, out of memory of the gamekeepers that looked after the game here at the farm. And we're standing on this track, and the field is quite high one side of us, and the soil is dropped away, and we've got a bank to look at, a soil profile. And if we just have a look here, quite close in, it is quite interesting. I'll bop down. There's a rabbit hole there, and you can see there's 3 coloured soil types, very distinct. The top one is one that everybody will know about. It's obviously called top soil, and if you dig a garden, it's usually about a foot deep. Here it's perhaps just over that, and that's where all the plants grow on. It's all full of natural nutrients. And then, over hundreds and hundreds of years, the rain washes through that soil and it dissolves minerals and elements into a very narrow band. And farmers will be quite familiar with it. It's called the pan layer. And it's quite hard, it's very distinct, and here you can see it's about 2-3 inches deep, and it's a different colour, and usually it gets stained with any of the elements that wash through. You often get an iron pan, it's called, and it's often associated with the bottom of a furrow where the horses used to plough, and later on tractors, always ploughing at the same depth, and it kind of smears the soil and makes it impervious. And then very distinctly just under that is a much lighter coloured soil, and that's called subsoil. And that's really important at High Ash Farm because our fields are full of worms, and the worms go right down, particularly in dry weather. They do something called estivating, and they almost hibernate because the soil's too dry in the topsoil for them. And so they'll bring up soil, they'll dig their little burrows quite deep down and bring up soil, and that can contain seeds. But the important thing is, if you're doing, lots of people are planting wildflower fields to try and help endangered bee species. And what happens is, this wildflowers that you sow kind of decide whether they like it or not. So if you sowed a mixture of, say, 20 wildflowers, you might have 5 or 6 that really thrive at the end of it all. And it all depends on these 3 layers of soil, what wildflowers thrive. In the high ash here, we've got lots of chalk, as I mentioned. It's right underneath where I'm kneeling, and if I carefully look in the side there, there's a little white crumb just fell down. And now if I get that and just crush it like that, you can see it's pure white, and that's why the pH here at the farm suits some of the wildflowers in a particular way. There we are, look, I've crushed it up and my finger's now gone white.
And these fragments are all in that lower layer and right up into the topsoil.
Absolutely. So the natural pH of the soil, the lime content, is crucial as to what's growing on top of it. So that means you have a particular set of plants, things like legumes. They rely on, need, and totally depend on the correct pH in the soil. They won't grow on acid soil, in other words. So things like the sainfoin, the clover that we have growing on the fields there. This one in particular, sort of brushing the top of my head, oxeye daisy.
Yeah, lovely display of the daisies here.
Yes. Oh, look above our head. Speaking above there, 2 buzzards checking you out, look.
There they are, circling, gliding on the thermals.
Yes, thermals today. So there we are. That explains why the flora and fauna is so variable out in the county, this particular county of Norfolk. It's how the glaciers left the soil. So we've got acid soils, lime-rich soils, which this is, and then it influences what grows on top hugely. And we've had a question to start us off this week. It's really interesting.
Yes, it's from Matt Hay. We love the names that fit in with what we do here. Matt, thank you for your note. He says he loves listening to the podcast, and it was great to hear you, Chris, discussing bee orchids in the last episode. We've got some popping up in my village, and they've been marked out with tiny stakes so the council don't mow them by mistake. Chris referenced the mystery of the orchids being self-pollinating, but they actually evolved to be pollinated by a type of solitary bee, the longhorned bee, and across much of their range it is still the primary mechanism for their reproduction, ensuring good genetic mixing to keep the species healthy. And if you didn't hear last week, and it's still available to listen to, the bee orchid has this sort of fake bee attached to the flower.
Yes, and everything about that letter is, Matt is completely correct there. And so I haven't yet seen a longhorned bee, although I did know in the past that the bee orchids must have lured in bees of a particular species, and many plants and flowers are pollinated by one species only. It is always quite surprising. So we're looking at this bank, we've seen the three soil types. It's rather like a sandwich with a dark layer in the middle, and if you look here, Matthew, there's lots of very fine soil. It looks like the screed layer at the bottom of a mountain.
Looks like sand.
It is come out, the sand portion of the soil has come here, and it's all come from this bank. But it hasn't been washed there by rain. It's been dug out by tiny holes. They look about the size that you could get a match head in them, and they're these solitary bees, not the longhorn bee that was mentioned there, but generally mason bees. And
so
it's peppered. Yeah, you've got your eye in there.
It's like a Swiss cheese.
Exactly, yes, absolutely full of all these tiny holes. And that's why I love these sort of features on the farm so much. I was always tempted to put a sand martin nesting colony here and make this wall a lot higher and put holes in it, an artificial one, because we have sand martins all around the farm. None nesting on the farm, unfortunately. They nest in the two local quarries in the sandbanks there, and they're delightful to see. Beautiful, beautiful little birds, close relative of the swallow and the house martin, but not the swift. And they're very local, and they feed in these valleys here across the wildflower fields at this time of the year. I love them to bits. They're literally called the river bird in their scientific name, Riparia riparia. Anyway, with going back to those orchids, Matthew, that's a really interesting question, because all around us, the field just at the top of this bank now has well over 1,000 bee orchids in, which we did last week. And I did say, as we follow summer through, follow the wildflowers that succeed each other, all offering something different for our pollinators, we'll go and visit another couple of the orchids this morning. And so we'll just hop back in the truck, and a very short drive, and I'm going to blow you away with their beauty. Come on, let's hop back in.
You could say on today's podcast we're being the Orchid Squad.
Yes, I think we are, yes, as usual.
Thanks to Matt for the email, and more questions coming up later on. Where did you put your car?
Oh, that's right down the track here. Come on. You're used to walking, aren't you?
The sun has disappeared, hopefully only for a short while. But here on High Ash Farm, it's such a pleasure to see the wildflower meadows, and we've come a bit higher than we were down in the gully just now, and Just looking out over this field, Chris, what a feast for the eye.
You're telling me, Matthew, and anybody can enjoy this because we're standing on the edge of a field and there's a wide mown track here. It's a public footpath called Boudica Way, and it runs right down the eastern boundary of High Ash Farm. So it's a lovely spot that you can visit, and just behind us is a lovely seat here, a cast iron seat, in memory of one of the ladies that walked here. She was called Dawn Victoria Hill, and so we've renamed this little spot that we're standing on Dawn Hill. So when I talked to Daniel or Neil, who both do a lot of the work here now, and I said, oh, just where Dawn Hill's seat is, they all know exactly where this location is. So I said I was going to spoil you this morning and enjoy some of the other species of orchid that we have here, and I've marked some further down the track, which are bee orchids, which we did last week.
So if you're walking down here, look for the canes, because
Yes.
Chris marks them out.
Yes, I do, and so you can actually photograph them, and here is a little delight for you. There's marked with a cane. Usually the canes have numbers on them, which are the amount of orchids that I've found, and this one's just a yard in from the track, and it's a beauty. And I invited a local photographer here yesterday, Laura Cuffin, and she's ace with the camera, and she laid down beside this. I mean, it is funny the things you have to do to get good photographs sometimes, and she's photographed this particular specimen, and although it's got common at the start of its name, it's stunningly beautiful, and anything but common these days. Is called a common spotted orchid, and here it is. Loves the high pH soil and the clay underneath it. So if we just bop down a little bit, you can see it's incredibly delicate, and there's a fly on it, and many people don't realise that flies and ants and lots of other insects are really, really important pollinators. Just look at this, and good identification feature is the leaves at the bottom look rather like the early purple orchid, which we have in the woodlands here at the farm, which love growing in shade, and they look as though they've been dabbled with spots of blood. These little spots on the bottom leaves are rather browner and blacker, and all the leaves are kind of have that pattern on them. Little rosetted leaves at the bottom, then a long stalk coming up, which at the moment is about 10 inches tall perhaps, and then it's topped with the most beautiful flower. It's got a rather unusual scent, and so it's attracting flies, and another one has just arrived. Matthew, can you see?
That fly is really enjoying it there, because he's not scared of us being nearby. He's much more intent on enjoying the pollen.
Yes, and the nectar as well. So it will use its little proboscis to go right down into the nectary. And you notice the two flies that have been here whilst we're here are feeding on the top part of the plant, the flower, I should say, because the bottom petals have already done their job. And this is where it starts to get interesting with orchids, what fascinates people. The seed from orchids, well, the best way to describe it is dust, because it doesn't have its own energy supply. You know, with wheat and barley and many of the cereals that we as humans eat, they've all got their own energy supply in them, as well as the germ to start off the new plant, and the energy supply that's contained within the seed sets it off, whereas with orchids don't have that. They rely on a fungus in the soil, and they kind of form a symbiotic relationship with the fungi, and so the soy seed is extremely light, not as light and as small as the next orchid we'll see, but this single flower can comfortably produce 10,000 seeds, and probably double that. It's such a huge task to count them, and there'll be lots here. So this is the first one out. We're right at the beginning of the common spotted orchid flowering season, and it's not until you get in close and look at the detail as to see why people become fanatical almost about orchids, so I'm always a bit at risk by marking them with these canes, and because this is open public access with a public footpath, it's rather like having your most valuable treasures that you have in your museum but no lock and key on them. So I kind of bite my fingernails, hoping that this particular one, right by the track here, is still here when you arrive, because I found it on Saturday. And I was just, to tell you how excited I get, I just gave a huge whoop and then looked round and hoped no neighbouring farmers were nearby to hear, because it is quite exciting when you see them, because there's literally, what we're looking at, several million oxeye daisies and tall buttercups as well, the succession is happening already, and the season, as it's cooler, everything's taking longer to be in flower. The foxgloves we looked at 2 or 3 weeks ago are still in full flower because of the weather that we're having. The plants are under stress from moisture or heat, which makes them go all through their flowering cycles very, very quickly.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it, that each year we have summer, but it's slightly different.
Yes.
And there are the variations in conditions, and it makes you marvel at how these plants are able to roll with the punches.
Yes, you're telling me, and they certainly do that. They seem to be coping very well with climatic change, because a year ago we were drought stricken on top of this hill, and this crop, the oxeye daisies, were all about as high as this one here. Look down here, 1, 2, 3, look, there's 20 oxeye daisies only halfway up there, brothers and sisters, and they'll be in flower in about a week to 10 days time, up level with the top of the buttercups, which are 2 feet tall. So a whole variety changes, and of course the grasses as well. There's one with a lovely pink flower head on just over there, not taking the attention away from the beauty of this orchid, but that's called Yorkshire fog, and it's a hairy grass, and normally it's 8 to 10 inches tall, and that one over there is already well over a foot tall. Beautiful grass species, and they're all coming into flower at this time of year as well, which is why anybody walking down this footpath is continually sneezing if they suffer from hay fever.
Well, it's a large field,
Yes.
and the general impression is of the yellows and the whites of these daisies, and the buttercups, and the green under furnishing as well.
Understory. And you can see the grass is suppressed, because wherever I look, if I just part those oxeye daisies there, what's there just in front of my finger? A dozen yellow rattle plants. And that's taking care of the poor grasses, which are in the understory, you see. So that's the other trick of establishing a wildflower field. If it's on an old meadow, the soil can be incredibly fertile, and plants like this orchid in front of us and some of the other rarer ones here just don't stand a chance. They're swamped out, particularly as farmers have left these old variety of grasses here and usually using in their silage fields, perhaps some in hay fields as well, modern varieties of grasses which are twice the height and yield twice as much. But why wouldn't you if you're a farmer? And of course that fights against this plant. The sun's just come out. Just look at that common spotted orchid, Matthew. Tearful.
We've waded into the wildflower meadow, which makes it sound like quite a small patch of land, but actually this is huge, isn't it? It must be one of the widest expanses of this sort of wildflower plant that there is in Norfolk.
Yes, it probably is, but I don't like to say I've got the biggest and the best. It's just what it is. Basically, this is a 40-hectare block, so 100 acres in old money. Brilliant wheat land. Farmers will be pulling their hair out and say, why have you got wildflowers here? And because of this around our feet, Matthew, there's oxeye daisies everywhere, sandfoin. Although the sun's just come out again, you are absolutely spoilt. There's a few buttercups, lots of bumblebees. In fact, in the next week, oh look, 2 bumbles, red-tail young bumblebees on one bit of sandfoin just there. That's a lovely sight. And just over there behind you, there's a large post and some stakes again there. Each stake's got a number on it, and those are pyramidal orchids or pyramidal orchids. There's a lot of argument among orchid specialists about how you pronounce it. It's obviously pyramid because that's the shape of the flower. So just it's just disappeared. There it is. So hard to see sometimes, but nevertheless it's another hands and knees job. And this is a truly special and beautiful
Fabulous
orchid.
colour, fabulous shape.
It is. So you've got that triangular shape. I'll just part the oxeye daisies away from it. This one's almost exactly a foot tall, and it will finish up about 18 inches tall. It's just started to flower, and you've got this deep purple rosetta flowers around the base of the pyramid, which gives it its name. Is that bee troubling you?
Not at all. No, I'm just enjoying him.
Yes, after the sandfoin right round your knee, and that's a red-tail bumble. Yes, just flew past the microphone there. Now, this orchid is rather different. It really loves this deep yellow clay that it's growing on. Really low fertility, so no competition. And it's getting its energy from the two tubers at the bottom, which is characteristic of all the orchid family, a double ovoid tuber it's called. As I mentioned last week with the bee orchids, one tuber is larger than the other, the small one supplying all the energy to put up this flower stalk. It's really another one of those erratic species of orchid where you can have 20, 30 in one spot one year and then none for 4, 5 years. It's the county flower of the Isle of Wight, and that helps solve the mystery as to why it grows in some places rather than others. Just inshore on the land from the Isle of Wight, you can see the White Cliffs there, and obviously that's the chalk layer, and that chalk layer snakes northwards from the White Cliffs of Dover, through North and South Downs, up towards Norwich where we are, and then heads out just into the North Sea. You've got a lovely chalk reef just out to sea off the Norfolk coast, skirts up the eastern coast and then goes back out to sea off the coast of Yorkshire. So it's quite a chunk of chalk, but in places it's only a mile or two wide and perhaps a few hundred feet deep, and we're situated bang on top of that chalk ridge, and that's why this orchid just loves it here. And again, it's a public footpath, only 20 feet from where we are, and right beside the public footpath there's a good dozen of these pyramidal orchids just growing away. Again, I mentioned something quite amazing with the common spotted orchid we just looked at, that common spotted single bloom could produce 10,000 seeds, and wait for it, the pyramidal orchid says I can top trump that, 50 to 60,000 seeds from one bloom. You just can't make it up. It's just unbelievable.
Why isn't the field covered with them then?
Exactly. That's how they are. They get themselves about. Now, that's a really interesting question, because I don't know how the orchids have got here. I've never put any seed here. It's such a fine seed that it will blow in the wind, the autumn gales, when this it's already thrashing about today in this rather cool breeze that we're having. And so the seed gets distributed over quite a big distance naturally anyway. And I did mention last week, animals walking past. We've got lots of hares in here, deer, and obviously the small animals can brush up against the orchid. If I just touch it like that, you see it wobbles, and this dust can come out and land on the back of a mammal and then come off somewhere else.
Because mice will nest in this.
Yes, they will. We've got all long-tailed field mice. We have a lot of harvest mice here at the farm now. They love these crops, and we often come across the nests high up in the tall tussocky grasses that we grow here around some of the field margins. Favourite nesting site would be cocksfoot, which is a really tall, coarse grass, and the female harvest mouse makes a lovely little tennis ball size nest high up on the stalks. But there we are. It's high pH soil, that's the secret here. I've not seen bees visiting this ever, and I've watched these plants in warm, sunny days in June and July, and they again seem to be self-pollinating, but I think if we sat here long enough, there'll be a particular bee species come, and there'll be over 100 little blooms, tiny little orchid flowers around the perimeter, coming up this central spike that makes the pyramid, which gives it its name. They'll be visiting that and pollinating them, and it'll be in flower here for about 3 weeks in total, from where it is now to when it's finished flowering. And then later on in the year we mow all this and remove it, which helps to keep that fertility down. And again, you can hardly see any grass here because the whole field is covered in yellow rattle. Look just by your feet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yellow rattle plants, and taking the nutrition away from the grasses, so there's no competition for this orchid. It's almost growing in its own little bare patch of soil down there on this bright yellow clay. Beautiful.
Lovely, subtle, pinky colour as we enjoy, just for a short time, the pyramidal orchid, or pyramidal.
Yes, so it will cause lots of fights today in amongst husbands and wives arguing as about how it should be pronounced. But I suppose if we take where it got its name from as a pyramid, perhaps the best way is to say pyramidal orchid, and you're fairly safe then.
The ducks at High Ash Farm going in to roost for an evening. Hey everyone, it's Matthew here, and if you've been enjoying our countryside podcasts, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yes, Matthew. What we're going to do is to ask for a small donation to help run the podcast, and any surplus goes for conservation at High Ash Farm here. And so it's really important. We'd both love to keep the podcast going, and that duck agrees with me, I think.
Well, it's straightforward to donate. You can make a one-off donation or set up a small monthly contribution, and the address is highashfarm.com/podcast.
We're hugely grateful for any support. It means we can keep sharing the stories of the countryside, which I love doing each week, but it's that small amount of cost we need to cover. So thank you very much in advance.
What a lovely sight. Well, we've completely changed our tack here as far as habitat is concerned. And this is one of the farm ponds. I remember coming here 2 or 3 years ago and this was dry. Plenty of water in it this year. And these curious red patterns just under the surface.
Well, the pond is blooming, Matthew. That's a technical term for what we're seeing in front of us. And I came here this morning, the sun was out early, just across the top of the water, and the pond just looked like a jigsaw puzzle, and where each of the pieces of the jigsaw fitted together was a bright sort of blood red line seething and moving like some snake just beneath the surface of the water. And we've got it's quite dark because the sun's gone in, unfortunately, but you can just make out these curious red lines. There's one quite close to us. It looks like a red bandage coiled up just under the surface of the water, very close to the top. And it's a blooming pond, and what you're looking at is copepods, but you might not have come across that word. But if I tell you cyclops, that's one of the members of the copepod family, you might sort of think of that Greek mythical giant with one eye in the centre of his head. Well, these little critters have one eye in the centre of their head, so we call them cyclops.
So these red clouds, as they look like really, in lines, these are lots of cyclops all together.
Yes, and what they're doing is they're mating. they're forming it. They all get together. They're all spread out equally over this area of water. It's deep. It's nearly 12 feet deep. That's 3 metres and a bit, nearly 4 metres deep. And because we had such a wet winter, they're really thriving in here. And so what happened yesterday, how I discovered them, is a large oak tree, which is right on the other side of the pond, fell right across the pond here. We're on top of a hill. It's again heavy boulder clay, and I pulled the tree out and I noticed that it was covered in ivy in November when it fell over in a gale, and the leaves have all been stripped. And I was puzzling in my head as to what had eaten them, and it was these creatures feeding on organic matter. They will feed on algae in ponds and clear your green water and make it crystal clear, and they're the foundation food. Although you think, what the heck is Skinner talking about now? Their cousins are plankton. Without plankton, we'd have no whales. We'd have a great fewer fish, if any, fish species. And here, these feed our native freshwater fish. So people actually farm them and grow them. You can put them in jam jars and teach children about them. And again, a surprising fact is copepods produce more protein than any other creature on the planet. That just stops and makes you think how important they are. So many things feed and depend on them. And these red, look, there's one quite close to the edge there. It just looks as though somebody's spilt red paint across the top of the water. And it's writhing and seething as we're talking.
And it's a living organism,
yes,
made up of lots of, many millions.
Millions and millions of them. Yeah, so it's just extraordinary. You'd think I'd kind of hidden something just under the surface of the water. If I'd brought a jam jar with me, I had meant to bring a torch, but I get so excited when we're going out on the farm, I forget half the things I'm meant to remember.
But there's always quite clear standing here, though, even in this light. You can see them.
Look, one of them's come up near the top, and it's doing anti-clockwise, and
it's a swirl,
and there's a fly landed on the top of the water above them, and the fly's going round in a circle, and says, "Who's going to stop me?" It's almost in a little whirlpool, and they come up to the top, and so the rapid movement is their mating, and just extraordinary. Oh, look, it's a perfect donut now, that one. Just out in the middle.
A hole in the middle.
Yes.
Like a solar system.
It is
out of space.
Exactly that. Oh, it's just to just come up a little bit closer to the surface while we're talking about them. So there we are, one of the foundation blocks of the natural world, and overlooked, hardly seen at all any time of the year, apart from when the pond blooms, which it is at the moment.
A rusty red colour. Look out for that when you're near a pond in the wild. Really,
yes.
they like it, but also horse troughs.
Yes, horse troughs as well on the farm. We've been cleaning them out this year. We do that about June every year, so the old debris from the previous autumn. And just look at that swarm of cyclops over there. A leaf has landed on the surface of the water, and the cyclops are swimming in a circle underneath it, and the leaf's now going in a circle. Yes, so there we are. Oh, it's just lovely. The sun's just peeping out a little bit, and it's just illuminating these particular blobs, which are about 7 or 8 inches across. And in front of us, I can just see this one perfectly now, a long snake-like appearance in the water.
Do you know what I thought when you led me here and I saw these red rusty shapes in here? I thought, Chris has got himself a carp complex.
Oh, yes, exactly, yes.
They do
yes.
look the same colour as some types of ornamental fish.
Yes, they certainly do, yes. I do know a joke about carp and the Noah's Ark, because Noah sort of made a mistake, but God actually wanted a multi-storey carp park. But we won't go into that one.
We're back at the farm vehicle, and we're just going to pop inside the car to have a look at some of the emails that have come through in the last week. And I'll give the email address out in just a few moments' time. But first, hello to Kay. Kay Brigance lives in Michigan, USA, on a small spring-fed lake behind the Lake Michigan dunes. I love the podcast and the joy and delight you express, Chris, about all aspects of nature, from the tiniest fungi to the deer. Your appreciation and explanations are wonderful. You've reminded me to revel in the wonder of the natural world. Well, Kay lives in quite a wild place there in Michigan. Lake Michigan's a huge body of water.
And we've just been looking at the one of the ponds on the farm, about 10 metres across, and she's top-trumped me there, so well done, and enjoy your local wildlife.
A photograph of a bird from a fair distance, but we'll find out if Chris can identify it. Terry Norman says, my wife and I were surprised to see this bird in our garden at Tackleston, which is not many miles from where we're sitting. My wife managed to take a couple of photographs, although they're not clear. Most noticeable was the bird's reddish tail. Are we right in thinking that this may be a black redstart?
Do you know, Matthew, sometimes people top trump anything that I've seen before. It's a perfect photograph of a black redstart. The male with the russet tail and the white marks on the wing. First glance, I thought it's a partially albino blackbird, but then I realised it's about half the size. It's quite a diminutive bird, but it's a migrant. Its close cousin is the common redstart, which has much more red on its body than the black redstart, but a striking, stunning and a scarce bird as well, quite often nesting in old industrial sites rather than in cliff ledges. So it's kind of started to move back into the UK at the end of the Second World War, when there was a lot of bombed out buildings in London, and quite a few nested there.
Moving on to one from Sue Nicholson, who has enjoyed all our comments so far about swifts and swallows. And she says, I always look forward to the return of the swifts each year as they come screaming overhead, rejoicing in the return of the summer weather. This year, I was treated to a wonderful display of aerobatics as a screaming party of swifts whirled around and round the village square like the red arrows. I was in Acle, a place very close to here, and there was some wonderful swift sound effects. You get the impression of them without even seeing them sometimes.
Yes, that high-pitched screaming, which sort of gave them that nickname that we used last week, the Devil's Bitch, they were called, because they had that sooty black plumage. And right on the field beside us, this is all laid out with mustard and fodder radish, no insecticidal sprays. And last year we had a flock, a colony, if you like, feeding quite silently over the top. It looked like a swarm of bees, well over 1,000 swifts.
Shane in Spixworth, I was wondering if you could shed some light on a small bird my brother photographed in Scole on the Norfolk-Suffolk border. Unfortunately, he only got the rear view, but the wall it's sitting on may help with identifying its size. It looks like an escaped canary. I was just wondering if there were any wild birds that it could be. There we are. Oh my goodness, that's a sort of bright yellow, like a chick.
Yes, it does look like that. There are a few birds with yellow on them. Wagtail is one, not the pied wagtail. The other one would be the yellow hammer, and it's nothing at all like that. It's a very chubby aviary escapee, and it's a canary. And we did have our own Norwich canaries. My father used to breed them, and we had a room in the farmhouse with lots of cages in. It was still called the bird room when I left the house 20 odd years ago, and he was an avid canary collector, and that's exactly what it is, a canary. Beautiful.
Hazel Burnham, hello to you. Hazel is a nature lover. She's got a bird nesting basket, and a bee was going into it the other day. I thought that was a little odd. On closer inspection, I realised it must have been a wasp, as there's the start of a wasp's nest in there. It's quite close to our back door and on our route to the garden. So what would you do, Chris?
Right, I would have a go. I'd trust it if it was a hornet's nest. Funny enough, they're quite mild-mannered, but wasps are notorious. They will sting without provocation, and It's inside that basket. There's one way of doing it by degrees, and that's to move the basket before the nest gets too big, just about a foot at a time until you get it outside. It's the foundation portion of the nest, so you're quite all right. Hole at the bottom, made out of chewed up wood, so it looks like paper mache.
Looks like an upside down conical flask.
Yeah, it does that exactly so. So that's one way of doing it, just to move it by degrees, or to bite the bullet and say sadly goodbye and hope the queen wasp builds a nest somewhere else other than inside. It's a bit risky. They'll get stuck inside your porch windows, and they can give a good account for themselves.
Well, there we go. Just a flavour of some of your emails. They're all read and appreciated, I know, by Chris, just as we see swallows swooping low over the field in front of us here.
Oh, look, they're all over, just hovering inches above, hoping for some aerial plankton in the form of gnats and flies. Perfect.
Chris at countrysidepodcast.co.uk is the email, and who knows, you may get a mention next week.
Yes, we're stacked to the rafters with questions, but we do our best to answer them as fairly as we can.
Let's go and watch some more of those swallows, shall we?
Yeah, off we go.